I'm actually one of the panelists, but I've been given a double task of also sort of being a quasi-moderator. So forgive me for doing my best to run the show for myself and the two gentlemen here. We're going to kick off by making a quick introduction just to give you a flavor of who we are and what we do. I'm excited to say that it's quite a mixed bag, and I think it represents the philosophy that we want to share with you very much. So I'll leave the titles aside, but you've got essentially a designer, a systems integrator, and I think Jeff takes on many forms, but today he's here as an innovator within the SME environment. So let me kick off quickly. My name is Bassam Jabry, and I'm the managing director of chemistry. We're a creative design studio, and we work very much at the intersection of human needs and technology. We work on large and complex challenges, and how do we bring a relevant end user solution using technology, using deep expertise from our clients, and bringing multidisciplinary teams together through a creative process to find and discover new solutions through relevant and researched insights. So very much coming at the other end of where IoT and technology comes from. So this is a little bit about me. I'll hand over to Malcolm.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. Malcolm Norquoy. I'm the business head, the head of Cognizant Services for Southeast Asia. Who is Cognizant? Allegedly, we're one of those monolithic dinosaur systems integrators, 250,000 people, $14 billion in revenue, who is actually rapidly changing to being very, very digital. And we'll come on to more of what that means and the relevance to this human-centric session as we move forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rico. I'm a lecturer of cultural robotics at UNSW. I'm also a peer of the Council of the Arts in Australia. And while I'm in Singapore, I work as the Director of Innovations for a small creative agency. And my position here is really looking at how we can leverage on new IP. Many of you who are in services understand that there is a type of glass ceiling in terms of how much you can earn, how much you can make. And we really see the creative design agency model being something of the 20th century. And it's actually a dying industry. So what we're really looking at is, on top of leveraging our creative capabilities, our media capabilities, how can we actually also develop new IP, new technologies, new services in order to survive in the 21st century? That's where I'm from.
Okay, thanks Jeff. So just to give you a bit of a heads up, we are going to cover the following topics. I'm just using my phone here as a guide. So the very first thing we'd like to touch on is convergence, and I think the three of us here really represent that, particularly what Jeff just shared about his industry or his work being transformed through the use of technology. The other aspect that I'd like to touch on is, of course, the key topic, which is how this can help the end user, and how the end user perspective is very critical in all this discussion to balance out the technology that's being put forward. And I think very much triggered by what we heard this morning, if any of you attended the keynote presentations this morning, the aspect of trust and privacy and security, control of information. And we're going to wrap it off before we look at some of the questions on talent and talent acquisition. And we also heard about jobs and job creation. So what is some of the new sort of work perspectives and the types of talents and skills that we need to have in the future as well. I think on the screen you also see there's an opportunity to post your questions. So I hope that in the 15-20 minutes that we'll chat for a while, that will trigger a whole bunch of questions for you. Please log on to the Pigeonhole Live app or use the live Q&A within the IoT Asia app to post your questions for this session. Does anybody have any questions for that? Are you all logged in? Or if you have any problems, just reach out to the ladies at the back. I think they can help you with getting logged in as well. If that fails, be brave, stand up and just ask us right away. Okay. So maybe, Jeff, I'll start with you on the topic of convergence. So can you elaborate a bit more about what you just shared and how the two domains are really sort of starting to come together?
So I think in every aspect of my various careers, from being a researcher and a lecturer at the university level, as well as doing commercial and creative work here in Singapore, we do see something that can be described as transdisciplinary, meaning that beyond the disciplines, how are we bringing together all sorts of capabilities and knowledges in order to provide solutions that are useful for everyone who's involved with that. So particularly from my research perspective, so I have a background in fine art, but I also have a PhD in engineering sciences. So one of the items of my research is really looking at, can we leverage on the artistic practices of, say, sculptors, and can we use that to inform the development of morphologies for robots? As we know, robots are emotive when they're in motion, but can robots be emotive when they are standing still? And so this is something that engineers, mechatronics, robotics researchers actually can learn a lot from artists and sculptors, people who work in 3 dimensions. And then again, from the commercial side, we, as I mentioned before, we're a traditional design agency. We do a lot of great work for Google, Twitter, Microsoft. We have quite a few great clients. But then at the same time, do we want to serve forever? And if I can just make a very anecdotal analogy of my company, we're essentially a bunch of anarchists who fell into capitalism. So at one point, we understand that we need to participate. We need to participate in market flow. We need to understand our clients and service our clients. But do we want to be trapped in that cycle forever? And so this is really where we start to, and this is where my position comes in, really starting to look at, as a creative agency, how can we still participate in things like IoT, natural interfaces, machine learning, artificial intelligence? How can we as a creative agency bring value to these developments, these technological developments? So quite recently I did a talk for Google Indonesia where I was addressing about 30 CEOs about machine learning and artificial intelligence. And this is, you don't necessarily think a designer or a creative has anything to say about that. But in reality, I think the wider conversation is very important. And these types of topics that affect society and culture should not be limited to just one particular group of people. And I think this is something that's reflected in the 2 keynote speeches that we heard this morning.
Thanks, Jeff. Malcolm, also, if we can hear from you, I think you have a slightly alternative perspective as well of convergence. So really like to hear your side of the story as well.
Yep, sure. So I've worked for an industry, quite frankly, that's always been capitalists. It didn't fall into it accidentally. The industry, not me necessarily. I'm not expressing my political views here. And what we're seeing now from that capitalist view, quite frankly, is that instead of the technology for almost technology's sake, so improving that technology and the incremental benefit you can get from that, be it end of life, be it improvements of that technology, the customers we're dealing with now have changed from being technologists to being business leaders, to being people leaders, to being market leaders. And the conversations that they are driving with us as an extremely large technology organization are all around customer experience, employee experience, improvement in engineering tolerances. That the metrics that, quite honestly, as a technology company, weren't things that we focused on. They were things almost above the line of where we operated. So what have we? So we've had to I'm as I go around on speaking events now, I use the word reimagine all the time. I know a lot of people do it. So we literally are reimagining ourselves into an organization that is focused on people and the impact on people. Because being in a capitalist industry, that is where the money is. And if you were in this morning's session with Vivian Balakrishnan, you'll have heard follow the money. And that's exactly what we're doing. So I've spoken a lot about that. How's that manifesting itself? We're not giving up what we do as a technology company, and neither are our competitors. So we do systems integration of ERP applications and infrastructure, be it cloud, be it as a service, be it bespoke. But what we are doing is that we are augmenting that dramatically. So every single one of our investment dollars is outside of technology. And some of the examples are honestly extraordinary. You'd never have thought this from, if you think of us, for those of you that maybe are thinking, who the hell are Cognizant, if you think of us as an Accenture or an IBM Services, so truly end-to-end, extremely large, can do most things for most men. Our investment dollars are going into companies like Idea Couture, a design thinking leading agency out of Canada, global, who spell technology with a K. They are nothing to do with technology. What they do is they reimagine paradigms, they reimagine journeys, they reimagine environments that you and I, as consumers or as employees or as citizens of our respective countries, experience every single day. It's quite hard for us to do, right? To take ourselves out of that paradigm we've been living in for 10, 20 years longer, you know, in many cases, and completely turn that around. Similarly, a very similar organization, Australia, called ODC, very similar to Idea Couture, and then probably the one that's most different, a large equity stake in a company called Red Associates. Very, very small company out of Denmark, anthropologists, psychologists, and no more. Again, what they do is they look at what makes us tick as individuals, what stimulates us as individuals. We hear about peeling the onion, really peeling the onion back to the center of why we do what we do, why we react, how we react. And it's not a technology piece, it's not IoT, but just give you an example of what the likes of Red Associates did and the way they think and where really the whole industry is going. Lego, 15 years ago, were going through a really, really hard time. No one was buying Lego, kids were bored of it, and so Lego called in Red Associates, and the question was, why aren't kids buying Lego anymore? So Red Associates did their consultancy bit, try to dig a bit further, and they said, is that really the question you want to ask? Or should you frame this a different way? And what they came out with collectively was, why do children play? Not why do they play with Lego, just why do they play? The absolute fundamental. If you can get to that fundamental, then you can get to the root cause of most things and then move on from there, productize that, process, drive that, whatever it may be. And just to finish off that story about Lego, big research around the world, over 26 countries, about 10,000 children, and that's where you saw the little Lego packs come out that started to really look like something, rather than somewhat nebulous block structures that certainly I, as an old guy, played with, and also the electronic components that came out into the products. So it was really getting down to the fundamentals and changing, and that's basically 90% of my job now as leading a technology company. It's really understanding what people are trying to achieve, the impact that has on people, and working back from there. So very, very different paradigm and mindset shift from a technology company.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. So that leads me quite nicely, I think, to wrap up that conversation. I think, to me, an embodiment of this convergence is the very fact that someone like me is sitting here in a conference today. It's not something that I would have expected. You know, I get invited to design conferences where I get to speak to other fellow designers. And then after a while, you realize there's really no point in doing that, right? I'm just telling my peer group the same things that they already know about. And so I'm really happy to be in a conference like this to bring across that different perspective. In addition to, I think, what you shared, Malcolm, that to hear companies like Cognizant thinking and speaking the same language as well. We used to have to beat the door down and sort of really explain what it is that we do and why it's important. Really born by a belief that what we do is very relevant. And I think it's great to hear that we no longer have to do that, that you're already in that phase of thinking the same way and activating things in a similar way. So the aspect of human-centered design, looking at what are the end user needs of going about their life, and how then does technology come in? I studied, obviously, design at university, and to me it was very implicit that, yeah, of course, this is how you would discover, you would uncover, real needs, you would ask the right questions, and you would find a good solution. And I'm still surprised to this day how many large organizations still get bogged down by the technology, by the systems, by the lingo. So we work a lot in the healthcare sector, and designing patient experiences is, one of the key things that we get brought in to try and cover. No, it's not just about healing someone, although that's the primary driver. But how do you make sure that that experience is relevant, it's pleasant, it's well communicated? How do you involve not only the patient but their next of kin and their caregivers in the process so that they are less stressed and can even help out and make the process easier for the staff who are typically overloaded and doing their best to deliver the healthcare practice? So this is a lot of the angle that we're looking at in terms of convergence as well. So moving on to the topic of technology and how that can help people, but really coming at it from a human-centric point of view. Jeff, any thoughts on that you want to share? So the application of human-centered design and how it relates to, let's say, we're here on talking about IoT today. So where do we come in to impact IoT?
Okay, so I think there's a lot of conversation about the smart city, and that's been a hot topic for the past couple of years here in Singapore. And so I'm going to steal a page out of a colleague of ours, Karen Awa, who talks about, yes, we can discuss the smart nation and the smart city, but what about EQ? What about the emotional intelligence of a city? We can have a city that is intelligent, but can we also have a city that is wise? So of course, there are aspects of having the city communicate to you in certain ways, or communicate through the sensors to tell you when a bus is coming, or when you need to stock up on a new product in your house. But at the same time, what is the manner of that communication? How is the system communicating it to human beings? Now, can this be done in a human-centric way? I'll pose this question to everyone. Now, we all know, especially those of you who work in multiple markets, that localization is very difficult, especially when we're talking about Southeast Asia, where you have such a fragmented cultures from Philippines to Thailand to Indonesia, Singapore, and so on, but you also have a very fragmented market. Now, if we are facing a new issue where the smart city knows everything about us as individuals, how is a system like this going to do hyper-localization for someone who is left-handed versus right-handed, for someone who is a male vegetarian versus a female vegan? Now, these are very important questions when we think about how much we can actually customize the data delivery and the data sensing that we can do through these smart cities. So my question is, and maybe this is something that you guys can answer from your respective fields, is that as a systems integrator, as a vendor, as a policymaker, how are you going to provide this type of hyper-localization to each and every citizen in the smart city?
Cool. Malcolm, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's basically a couple of real-life examples. One here, one in Latin America that I think are key in terms of bringing the people aspect around what is primarily a technology. It's an IoT solution with the full stack of integration analytics and then responses based on output from those analytics rather than necessarily just dashboards. So the first is right here in our, in Singapore. Unfortunately, reasonably recently, there were some fatalities on the MRT line, and it was all around maintenance checking. So it's physical maintenance checking. There is now a whole raft of work going on, actually not just on the train lines, but right across Singapore, to remove people from that situation, have people manage that, have that automated. So things like the use of drones right across the railway tracks doing inspections. Haven't quite yet got to the part where robotics on drones can perform the maintenance itself, but dramatically reduces the impact on individuals. And in all fairness, it actually increases the accuracy, the speed, reduces cost. There's a whole bunch of benefits there for society. The other one that's going on at the moment in Singapore is around something that for those of us that live here, has probably affected some of us, if not all of us, is that very occasional failure, and it is only occasional, of course, in Singapore, when the MRT breaks down. Now, we heard a little bit earlier this morning about, understanding each other's patterns and behaviors. A lot of us in Singapore have an Easy Link card. And it's as simple, guys, as, you get on the MRT in the morning, at one end, you get off the other. It's traced through your card. And it's there for all sorts of reasons, to make sure there's enough trains in the system, etc. There's capacity gets filled, it's for safety, a whole bunch of other reasons. And at the same time, though, when there's a failure on the MRT, is ensuring that that pattern that you take every day is understood and that you are given personalized, localized information around where you need to get to. You go on that route 5 times a day, every week, so the chances are you're still going to go to the same destination. So in the event of an MRT failure, what are the buses you could take? Where's the taxi rank you could take? When will the train be up? So it's giving you personalized information for you. So again, very, very much thinking of the human side of this, not just a case of what do we do in the event of a failure. It's helping the people. And then Latin America, there's quite a few examples around the mining industry there. So as digital mine has come in, which has driven actually a lot. If you look back through what IoT is, a lot of that's been driven by environmentals, the likes of Schneider Electric, Johnson Controls, which have been around a long, long time, and collecting that data. And miners, a lot of the mining industries and the oil and gas industries have picked on that in isolated pockets. And the terminology of the things like digital mine has come through. And digital mine has got 2 aspects to it. One is environmentals, and the second is people safety. And I've been talking to a couple of quite large global miners recently, and it's been interesting to hear about absolutely fantastic IoT products that have been personalized to certain environments. I give you an easy example. For large machinery, there's probably 4 or 5 manufacturers worldwide. Each has a proprietary IoT environment, which is both environmental and predictive in terms of the machinery in which it sits. But they have 5 different manufacturers, and they need to be able to take that data together so they can be more productive, so that they can make sure they get a maximum ROI, but also for people's safety. And the mining industry is absolutely paranoid about people's safety. So if we can't get that, so great systems in isolation from an IoT perspective and the platforms on which they sit, but getting that information into a central environment to be able to collate that, understand what is where, when, including people and the wearables, so they can connect that information, make sure everyone's safe, is proving far more difficult than it should be. Because the IoT space, the vendor space in that particular instance is driven by their own environment. It's not been human-centric in terms of its design, or even enterprise-centric, quite frankly. So hopefully there's a couple of examples you can see, good ones where it connects together with a human-centric factor at the fore, and some as well where you can see where a technology solution on its own, built bottom up without the human part of it, can miss actually really the end goal or the art of the possible in full.
Yep, great. So thanks, great examples. I think that you sort of hit the nail on the head, because what we heard this morning is, 2 keywords that stood out for me. One was collaboration, and the other one I think was fragmentation, right? So it's inevitable in a competitive landscape that you will have different people working on the same thing, but using their own systems and their own solutions. It's a competitive marketplace. It's very healthy, I think, to drive innovation and drive ideas in one respect. But it's exactly that. When you have large and complex operations, who is actually responsible for looking at the process or the flow from the lens of the very, very, very end user who is engaging in that system, and taking that journey through their eyes, through their perspective. And I know that I always struggle with this, because to me it's very obvious, and I'm sure that people would always see things that way. But as I said earlier, I'm confronted time and again of how that often gets missed out. That we get so entrenched in our lingo, in our areas of expertise, the way that a lot of industries are structured, especially large mining corporations, or even something like SMRT. People have departments, they have their areas of expertise, and the end customer, the passenger, becomes this other entity that's at the tail end of the process. And we've come in many instances to string together that experience to make sure that every step of the way the customer journey, the customer experience makes sense. And as they flow from one point to another, there's a clear carryover from that. Customers don't see, when they walk into a hotel or when they walk into a hospital, they wouldn't see that, oh, this is handled by the IT department, and this is the facilities management, and this is down to HR. They see you as a consistent and singular brand as such. I think the airlines have done a good job. Some of the hospitality companies that we've worked with see that very clearly. Where we feel we've made some significant impact is, again, in the healthcare domain, and one of our projects that we worked on is an ultrasound device for developing markets. So there's a very, very significant impact in terms of bringing better healthcare to the hands of midwives in developing countries where there's a shortage of doctors. And we worked with GE Healthcare on this project to research, go out on the field and really understand the needs and the environment that these midwives work in, and bring those insights back to the table and run multidisciplinary creative workshops with the team to understand it wasn't about taking a standard ultrasound and defeaturing it. It was really starting from the ground up of saying, how do we apply ultrasound in this environment? How do we help midwives who are not trained as doctors to diagnose pregnancy issues early and flag that up so that mothers can seek the help that they require before it's too late? So these are very good examples where we've been able to make an impact, and impact technology as well, and impact the thinking of large organizations to modify the way that they would apply their technical solutions in a different way. On that note, I want to move on to the last two topics. So, and I think you mentioned a bit about the SMRT and also with the healthcare domain, this aspect of privacy. So a very, I think, complex and touchy subject of how do you actually balance the needs of privacy as an individual with the benefits that that might bring by having access to all that information. Maybe Malcolm, over to you with an example or story that you could possibly share.
Yeah, I mean, this is we were talking about this earlier. Incredibly difficult to manage, quite frankly. There's the macro and the micro levels of this. So we were discussing, opt out, opt in. If you opt out at the macro level, then you really are out. So it's an opt in, and this could be with your telco provider, as simple as your telco provider. So you opt into your telco provider because you have that subscription. But then within there are a whole bunch of services which will be, or at least be attempted to be, very personalized to you. Location-based services, marketing-based services based on your internet behaviors, your surfing behaviors, the right place, relevant ads, etc., going to you, relevant offers going to you, etc. And then how do you opt out or opt into that? So I quite frankly, I'm not sure we have the answer yet in the public domain. It's a lot easier in the enterprise space for sure. We're working with a lot of insurance and banks around the world who are unable to use the power of the data that they have. They're legally unable to use that and leverage it. The same with telecommunications companies. I think that's going to change. There is a bunch of legislation coming through, especially if you look at MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore. There are a bunch of changes around use of data, privacy of data, and how you can leverage that. Forever we've had this challenge or opportunity, whichever way you look at it, around monetizing data, what that means, and I think we've probably all been on the end of some of our data being monetized without our authority. And trust is paramount. Again, talking to executives in enterprises and government ministries, the trust of the people, the trust of the consumer that their data is well looked after, is not misused, is any use of that data is known in advance and is transparent, is absolutely essential.
So it's really how you present that data, and how do you engage the end user again with the process of choosing how they would opt in or manage what information is being flowed.
Yeah, it's a bit of that. That's the interoperation between organizations as well. So there's been a few pieces written about the fact that there's some statistic around 75% of people jump from one corporation to another. It could be a utility, it could be a telecoms provider, it could be an airline, it could be a car manufacturer, because their data was misused. Their data was either wrongly represented or was used in another environment without their permission. Now, it could have benefited them, and maybe it did, but it was without their permission, and that trust factor has gone. You know, that's something that a lot of people have focused on. So the summary for me, I don't think we're there yet. I think we've got a long way to go. There's a lot could be done, but how we absolutely ensure that security, I'm not sure we're there yet.
Cool.
So I think we need to really understand that privacy is something that is culturally significant. I don't necessarily think we can put a complete blanket over what is considered privacy in the Western sense as it is compared to what is considered privacy here in Asia. If you look at a market such as China, the concept of privacy is actually quite different than how we consider the concept of privacy is, say, in the States or where I'm from in Canada. So I think that type of understanding is actually at the root of the way we approach services and privacy. The second aspect of this is, and to be very, very honest, I mean, a lot of us are very willing to give up some measure of privacy in order to gain some type of service. And so I think understanding this juxtaposition and how this balances out is actually something that every company needs to consider in terms of their services. For instance, the choice of releasing privacy, should that be centralized and controlled, or should that be decided from a peer-to-peer standpoint? So this is where technologies such as blockchain become very interesting, because this allows for some measure of anonymity, but at the same time, there isn't, because if you think about how each block in the chain needs to be self-confirming and confirming with other blocks, then in a sense that is not anonymous, because we understand that we're all part of a network. So I think when we're talking about privacy, at least on this platform, we really need to consider how we are defining this term privacy and what it means in the context of its use. So for instance, in Asia, I think a lot of people think less about privacy, to be honest, than people do in the States. But that's just my personal opinion.
I think there are definitely cultural differences and things that we're willing to give up in some countries, where in other countries people would be freaking out. I mean, in the UK, they're still very resistant to an IC card, while here it's very, very common to be using that. And I keep sort of thinking twice every time I have to post my IC card by phone or post, or hand it to someone to make a copy of. I think there's probably 1 million copies of it floating around. Great, so we've got about less than 10 minutes left. I want to switch a bit to some of the questions that are coming through as well. If you have any, please add them to the live Q&A for this session. You have to find the session on the list, and then I can see your questions up here. You're also welcome to put your hand up and just stand up and ask your question, sort of old school style. Also works. I'm going to answer one that's gotten a few popular votes, and then I'm going to leave the difficult one for you, Jeff, after that. So there's a question that says, what's a good approach to validate if a solution works without having to do a full system rollout? It's a great question and a very tough one as well, particularly in this context of IoT, where the scale can be quite enormous. So the short answer from my side would be what we call prototyping. So being able to embody or manifest the solution in the lowest and simplest version of it possible. What that means is that if it's a physical area, make it out of cardboard. If it's an interface, then just mock it up in PowerPoint or Keynote, if you're a Mac user, just to click through the experience and just role play what that process looks like. Now, I'm aware that this works well in a constrained setting, in a more simplified setting. So if you say, how do you do something that replicates the impact of IoT across an entire city, that becomes indeed a more complex question. So the challenge here would be to find ways to embody that on a smaller scale, and see how you can then replicate as you test and validate certain components of your idea. But I can't stress strongly enough that how important it is to quickly prototype and test out ideas. I've seen a lot of organizations, again, fall in love with their own thinking. And there's a lot of validation within the team. And you start to believe that, of course, this is on the correct path, and my end customer will surely like this, only to get kind of a very rude awakening at the end when the thing doesn't fly. So test fast, test early, and find ways that you can embody that in a quick and cheap way. I think the other thing is to change mindset, cultural mindset within the organization. We think a lot in terms of success or failure. You need to take that out of the conversation. So when you test something, you're just learning. You're finding why something worked, and in a very inquisitive way, looking at ways you can make it better. And that will actually release a lot of pressure and stress from the team to put out ideas and try them out and see if they're actually successful. I don't know if, Jeff, you want to add anything to that?
Just 2 minutes, yep. So proof of concepts, I think hopefully we've all kind of got that, which is exactly what Bassam's saying there around the prototyping, and hopefully everyone's kind of getting with or has completely mastered Scrum and Agile and Lean, and that's exactly what it is. Break it down into small components, test each component. Is that end-to-end? No. You still have that to do, but test it fast. I'd actually use the other phrase, which is fail fast. Fail really quickly. Encourage people to test and fail, go back and reiterate, and that's why you break it down into small parts. So it's an age-old...
I know exactly what you're saying, but I avoid that word fail, because as soon as you put that on the table, it just gets people into a panic. But absolutely, I agree with you.
I think it's more encourage the ability to fail rather than fail fast. So ensure people know that that's an acceptable part of the process, and then move back, do it again, and keep going. It's the improvement part. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm throwing Jeff the tough one. Before I go into that, anybody would like to share a question or ask a question from the floor? Old school style? Yes.
So if I can just paraphrase that for everyone, so the fail fast is supported. It's a good thing, but it's a moment in time, and I think that's a really good point. And if you look at where we are in this IoT journey, just IoT alone, and then the stack below that IoT, that actually results in outcomes, results in decisions, results in us having a far better life, quite frankly. That's going to be continuous improvement the whole time, and I think we're seeing that. I've been in the industry far longer than I would care to imagine, quite frankly, and never seen such a rate of change. So, really good point. Really good point.
I think I can just add a little bit to that too. In terms of failure, I think the wisdom behind serendipity is very important. So, as you go through failure, you need to be wise enough in order to notice when this failure can actually be a success. So sometimes when you fail, there are moments that we just let it go and chalk it up to failure because it didn't reach a particular parameter. But if you are wise enough, you can actually catch these moments of failure and spin them around and turn them into successes. So I think that's a very important component to that as well, to that process.
Okay. In fact, the app is telling me that the session has ended, so I think on this successful note, we've been digitally closed. It's some IoT device that spun me off. So if there are no more questions, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope it was a useful session. I'm actually going to run off to Opal 101, which is on the other side, to run a very fast design thinking workshop or human-centered design workshop with my colleagues. So if you're still interested in the topic, do join us there. Otherwise, I'd like to give a big hand to Malcolm and Jeffrey, and thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon.